In this video, I'm on Vancouver Island in conversation with Bill Caldwell, Rob DeClark, and Rand Teed. We're exploring the importance of family in the recovery journey. A recurring theme throughout all of my conversations is that many people need a supportive community to help them move successfully through their recovery journey. And family, in whatever form it takes, is a natural part of this. But working with family members comes with its challenges.
Well, thank you for being here, gentlemen. Rob, I'm going to start with you. Addiction impacts families in a tremendous amount of ways, but maybe you could help us understand some of the ways that addiction plays itself out in the household.
You know, with having anybody in the family who's struggling with a medical condition of any kind, it's hard, as everybody, is obviously worried about, the outcome, right? Everybody wants to see somebody get well, and they can't control it. And so as somebody, as their addiction starts to, as it starts to progress, and as they start to see that something, is clearly wrong and they can't explain it necessarily either, families want to know why and what's going on, and that person becomes the focus. That person becomes the real focus of everybody's attention. As somebody, as addiction starts to progress and it becomes obvious, as to what the problem is, and as to what's happening, that becomes the 100%, focus of the family, is trying to solve this issue that is, right, that they can't control, that they can't solve.
What does that look like in terms of solving it? What types of behaviors might you see?
Well, you'll see, sort of trying to get in the way of somebody's using, stop somebody from using by, taking away their bank cards, managing their money, managing their cell phones, looking through their emails, trying to figure out that this is the, there's going to be some way that I'm going to be able to stop this person from using, when in all reality, they need a direct intervention and treatment likely, right? I've seen families that have removed doors off of, so like no one could use, right? They took all the doors off of all the bathrooms and everything in the house, as if that was going to be the cure for addiction, right? And get into, sometimes fairly extreme and really disruptive behaviors in a household. So if you're the brother, and let's say they're one of your other siblings is the person that's suffering with addiction, you may not be, how come there's no doors in my room, right? How come there's no, I don't get any attention, right? The person suffering is getting all the attention from the family. And so it starts to erode, family communication, family dynamics change, and the focus really starts to shift on how do we solve, this big sort of elephant in the room, as the old cliche goes, the person who's suffering.
Bill, in your experience, what ways has addiction impacted families in a common thematic way?
I think, Rob already touched on it, but what I see is families organizing themselves around the problem. People start walking on eggshells, nervous. Families always think that they have sort of way more control than they have over a loved one with addiction. And the consequence is a lot of fear around, don't say this, don't upset them, don't do this. I've seen families go as far along the extremes as, okay, well, if we can't stop them from using, then we're going to provide the supply, right? So now mom's going out to buy alcohol, or, I've worked with a dad one time who thought it was very reasonable to be going out and buying opiates for his son on the street. So we see these behaviors that outwardly are really sort of strange, but when you think about it in the context of what am I doing to sort of medicate my own fear behaviorally, it's about how do I try to control them so that I don't cause further harm. Families often operate on a belief that I've created the problem in the first place, and so I need to be the one to solve it, when we generally know that's not the case. And so we see a lot of behaviors that, like I say, are outwardly strange, but in fact are very sensible in terms of trying to control the addiction. They just are ineffective, and the whole family unit starts to circle and spiral a little bit on that.
Let's talk a little bit about engaging with families in a treatment context. What are ways in which we would start to understand who this family is and to what extent they could be an asset to the treatment process? Randall, go to you.
Well, one of the things I think is really important to understand is that they've been really affected by what's going on, and so they're suffering a significant stress response to this situation. And at the same time, the person who's getting the treatment has crossed a line. And so they know that they're getting better. And very often the family gets stuck in, well, what's going to happen? What's next? What can we expect? And so in the treatment system, part of what we have to do is really help them understand the neurobiological nature of addiction and the fact that this isn't a bad person thing, that they've disrupted their capacity to make choices and do the right thing. And that similar thing has happened to the family. They've been totally focused on trying to fix the problem. So getting them to start looking at themselves and starting to assess, okay, what do I need to change? How do I need to manage my emotional response to things better? Those kinds of things become a really important piece of the family treatment program.
Right. One of the things I've experienced over the years is families often don't realize or appreciate the totality that addiction has taken on them as a family unit. How do you start the process of uncovering that? Do we start with education? Do we start with a psychoeducational response? What does the process of working with the family look like? Go to Rob.
I think one of the first challenges in working with a family and trying to get them to understand the impact is to get them to answer the question, how are you, outside of the context of how their loved one's doing. So often, if the person's sober and doing well and in treatment, then they would say that they're doing well. But if they relapse, then they're not doing well. And we know that this is, this is a progressive illness. Relapse may happen, and that they just is to try to get the family to focus on themselves. How are you actually doing, right? How has this impacted you? So I would say that's a combination of some education, as well as a combination of them getting in touch with their own fear, which is often that's what Bill talked about, that, what's sort of kind of driving this behavior and this sort of wanting to control it. Underneath all of that is an immense fear, right? So getting them in touch with themselves through some education, and then some psychotherapy, where we're going to have that person be able to reflect on the impact, how it's impacted them, and then as we move into treatment, how are they going to take care of themselves, regardless of the outcome of their family member.
Right. We talk a lot about the concept of recovery capital, and I'm wondering, we think about it a lot at the individual level, but thinking about recovery capital at a familial level, how would we start to unpack just the conceptual understanding of it, and what is the recovery capital of, say, this family? And maybe Randall, go to you.
Being able to start to assess how they are and start to evaluate what's hurting them, what are they worried about, and helping them pull them into the present, not getting too caught up in the past, is a really good place to start. But if you use that recovery capital index, 90% of it is totally applicable to everybody in the family as well. And so an initial assessment when they come in and see what are they missing, what can you add to your exercise regime to get you feeling a little bit better, what can you add to your spiritual connection, are you sleeping, are you eating, those kinds of things.
Bill, help me understand how we would delineate between a family or a family member that is an asset in the treatment process, or we've had those experiences where there may be a deficit. How do we understand that and unpack that, and how would we handle that situation?
I think that's probably one of the very first things we want to understand. The temptation is always to jump in. When we have somebody in treatment, the temptation is to jump in and enlist the whole family and gather around and try to use that same sort of circle around them system. When really what we should do first is start to build some of those relationships with families, spend some time talking to each of them, involve them, and understand, is this somebody that's going to be helpful and an asset? Is this somebody that's on board and is maybe interested in doing their own therapy and understanding what they bring to the table in terms of problems and in terms of solutions? Or is this somebody who's actively still in their illness, right? Because we have families over the years that we've tried to involve and found out that they were using as much or more as the person that was in treatment. And as part of the illness, what we see is not intentionally, not purposely, but sometimes we see families that as you get better, it sort of shows me that my behavior is getting worse. And so there's like an underground investment in keeping you sick, because the better you get, the worse I look, right? So we want to do a lot of those evaluations and assessments. Sometimes those are formal assessments. More often, I think they're more just conversations and getting a sense of where you're at and what you think about all of this. Then we move on to some educational pieces, because there's always going to be that, not always, but often there's going to be that sort of sense of like, this is a moral problem. Like Jimmy just needs to work harder and get back to school or whatever it is, when really it's about, he's working through an illness. And we need to help you see that so that you can start to see the behaviors and also understand what your reactions are to your kid or to your spouse or to whoever your loved one is that's in care.
Help me understand that concept a little bit more, where as an individual maybe getting better, getting healthier, maybe the family member you're alluding to is sort of losing value in that process. Is that codependency?
It is, and it works in a couple of ways. One, if we have somebody who's sort of in active using, then obviously it makes their behavior a lot more obvious. If somebody's saying like, Dad, I can't come home for Christmas if you're going to be drinking at the table, and Dad is taking on a position of like, I absolutely can't drink, then just don't come for Christmas if that's the case. Then, we see like there's efforts to maintain their own illness. In codependency, we see a similar pattern. And what often will come up is people will start to get better and the family will continue to feel awkward and strange and bad and struggle with their own anxieties and fears and attempts to control. And there's been times where we've tried to involve families early in the process, but they don't want to get therapy or help for 6 months or so, because after 6 months or so, they see their loved one doing really well. They see them, out in the world and behaving in a healthy way, and they're still feeling that anxiety and they're still feeling that stress, and they're wondering, well, I thought you were the entire problem. So if you're now doing well and I'm still not doing well, maybe I do have a part in this. But sometimes it takes people a while to realize that.
What does best practice look like in terms of engaging with family members on a clinical and non-clinical level in a treatment setting? How often? What should those engagements look like? To what extent are family members involved in a treatment process?
When an individual arrives for treatment, the first best practice is to get a release of information for the family members that they wish, for us as the treatment providers to be in contact with. So, a small technicality, but if violated, can absolutely destroy the therapeutic relationship you have with the client that's in care. So they provide a consent. At which point we would, call in the first 48 hours to sort of, just sort of introduce myself. That and it would normally be the counselor. Will be the counselor within, sort of the primary therapist or the counselor within that treatment setting. They would be the ones that would be in contact with the family members. Set up and gather information. Part of what's happening in a treatment process in the beginning is that we're doing assessments and we're trying to, find out more about the individual that is in our care. The family is a great resource. We know addiction has a strong component of denial in it, and is shame based. So people come into treatment with a lot of shame. So when we ask them how much they may have been using or some of the consequences, they could be in denial or they could just not be comfortable sharing that with us. And often, family members can provide us with information that is helpful and can sort of help to round out the profile that we're building, with that client. After that, it would be, it is kind of every 2 weeks, whatever sort of the length of stay of the treatment is that you would certainly have a midpoint check-in with families. And as you move towards discharge, you're going to want to ensure that are involving the family in a discharge call. That discharge call is going to be somewhat logistical, and then obviously this is what we're doing after. These are the recommendations. If at the same time as the person's in treatment, the family member has done some of their own work, that's not just a discharge plan for the client, that should be a discharge plan for the family, right? So the client's going to do this work, they're going to go to 12-step meetings, they're going to see a counselor, family's going to go to Al-Anon, and they're going to see a counselor, or maybe this couple's going to do couples therapy. We often think of discharge planning just to do with the client, but the family should have their own as well. I think one of the important factors with the release of informations and the sort of paperwork side of setting the expectations of communication is to revisit it throughout treatment, maybe one more time throughout treatment. I think you should revisit all documentation that somebody signs on day one should be revisited a few days down the road when perhaps somebody's less anxious, less nervous. They could be intoxicated when they come into treatment.
How do you avoid situations where you're working with both groups, the individual in care and the family that's supporting the individual, where pieces of information about both parties are coming about, and how do you walk that line between what looks like collaboration in care or collusion?
Yeah, certainly the best practice there is to have conversations together as often as we can. If we're all in the same room, there's no discrepancy about what was said, right, and who said what. If you're working individually with the family member in their own sort of family program, or they're doing their own work with the organization, then there's confidentiality that those conversations we don't sort of cross, sort of disclose and have information go back and forth between individual sessions. Often different people are working with the family, which would be ideal, and not have the same therapist working with them. But when it comes to after that sort of gathering information, call at the beginning, and that sort of assessment call at the beginning of treatment. If it's possible within your treatment setting to involve the client in the rest of the phone calls, it goes a long way to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Rob, in your experience, how important is setting the expectations for communication with family in terms of cadence, in terms of types of communication? Can you speak to us about that?
Yeah, right away, even before treatment, if you can, you want to be able to set up the expectations. Family members may want daily updates, and you just don't likely have the staffing resources and have enough time. And honestly, there isn't that much that will change on a day-to-day basis with somebody. Family members need to know what you're going to share and what you're not going to share. So we're not going to tell you what they say in their individual sessions. What what people are going to talk about in group. We'll give you updates. They're participating. They're not participating. Right? They are doing well. They're not doing well. They seem to be socializing with their peers or not. Yes, they're are they doing their written work or kind of level of participation. So really important to set expectations that we'll talk every couple of weeks, or we will talk in the middle of treatment. Here's the outlined so the schedule of communication. Right. And then here's what we're going to talk about. So don't ask me how many times has my loved one used this substance or that substance, or when did they start, or because those that's the information that we're not going to share.
Right. How important is it in those scenarios to let the individual that you're working with in treatment know that you're having those communications?
Well, extremely important. You need the release of information to start, so you need permission from the client to talk to their family or loved one. And then there are ways in which within that release of information that that a client can restrict what is shared to a family member. So that documentation should have those options to it. So it might be my presence in the program only. Don't want any therapeutic information shared, and that you're not only should you have that conversation with the client. Here's what we usually talk about. What is it that you would like? Is there anything that you would not want us to talk about with your family? But also that should be part of the actual documentation in the release of information, so that you have that in writing. There's two reasons. One, there's a liability issue with sharing information and breaking confidentiality that person, could certainly come back to the center with some type of grievance. The second one is that's the fastest way to erode therapeutic rapport with a client is that they think you're working too much with the family against them. That will almost just kind of inevitably stop the treatment process.
Right. So what I'm hearing is it's critical to set the expectations in terms of how we're going to communicate, how often, the mode of communication, and probably very important to understand how that works for families. Maybe they're working in different time zones, or maybe they're working, night shifts, day shifts, so really understanding those factors, but being very clear about the conditions of how communication will take place.
More and more, I've moved to a model of, if I can, I advise the therapist within our centers to involve the client in the conversation, have them there. I mean, do the update together. Then there's no sort of possibility of this is what you said or didn't say, or that a family's going to kind of misconstrue something. If you can, have them present for as many of the conversations as possible.
Right. Is there too much communication or too little, Rand?
I don't think so, and I really like what Rob just said, because that creates an opportunity for the counselor or therapist or to start to assess the communication that's going back and forth, and to help the family see what's improving, and help the patient to see that the family's coming alongside. And so those conversations with everybody together can become really a big part of that therapeutic movement through treatment.
Rand, you've worked with many families over the years while on individuals in a treatment setting of all kinds. What are the best practices that you've seen in terms of communication and just working with that family?
Well, one of the most important things is regular communication, and both Bob and Bill and Rob talked about the importance of connecting with them and checking in on how they're doing. Because typically what's been happening is all of the energy in that family has been directed at the problem and that person. And so you pull them out of the environment, and then what's going on? What do? We don't have to keep checking on this kid. We don't have to keep taking doors off. We can put the doors back on. And so our job becomes checking with them and seeing what they're doing to get themselves feeling better. They've been typically blaming everything that's been going on negatively in the house, either on the person or the problem or both. And when you pull that person out of the picture, one of their thoughts is, oh, they've gone away to get fixed. Everything's going to be okay. And so we need to check with them and check how they're managing their day-to-day life. Because what we don't want to happen is for nothing to change at home. Because not that they have been the cause of the problem, but home typically becomes part of the problem, because everybody's dysregulated, everybody's focus is all over the place. So helping them create some stability in their own emotional response to things, and start to look at their own pieces of what's been going on and what's been hurting them. Yes, the person with the substance issue has caused trouble, but what else is going on? Often I find that they're still carrying a lot of stuff, maybe from their childhood. Maybe they grew up in a similar situation. And so the anger that they had about their dad or their mom has been transferred to the person in the house with the substance problem. And so getting them to start to look at some of that and start to learn how to let that stuff go and start to forgive what's happened, but also forgive themselves for what they did or what they didn't do, I think are really important discussions that need to be had.
How fast do you start to have those discussions when someone initiates treatment in any setting in Alberta, as they will? How fast should that organization or their professionals be reaching
really
out?
Quickly, I think, because I think it's important that the family doesn't think that the fix is just this person going away somewhere. I think they need to be engaged in conversations, both about how the person with the substance problem is doing, but more importantly, what do they need to be doing? We talked about going to Al-Anon and going to Nar-Anon or whatever the most important group is, working with a professional themselves so that they can start to work through some of the anger, some of the disappointment that they've been carrying about what's been happening.
Right. Bill, how do we start to address situations where the household may be in quite a state of disarray? For an example, where a husband and wife, and maybe both, are struggling with addiction, but only one has initiated care, and you know that. How do you deal with that?
Well, you start to look at what are our options. Is it an option for both to come into care, maybe at different centers? That we've There is places that are set up that both can come together, but more often we see success when people have an opportunity to work on their own stuff and then come back together. So we start to see if that's an option. If it's not an option, we start to think about, is there a transitional way that we could approach this? Could we think about maybe moving into sober living or some kind of second stage housing following treatment for the person who's looking to get well at this time, to give them an opportunity to sort of come face to face with life and work through their stuff before they have to go back into that environment where it's, almost having to refuse it all the time. Because it can be quite overwhelming to be practicing new skills with just day-to-day living while also trying to take on a role where you're almost the therapist to your spouse, which is, disastrously stressful. So we try to create a situation where it's less of that hot tub into the pool experience and more of that gentle transition back. Sometimes that's second stage housing. Sometimes that's really intensive aftercare support with, individual sessions and daily treatment, that sort of thing, rather than just a group. Certainly both. But yeah, we try to be very conscious of it because it's going to be the highest risk situation that they go back into. And we don't want to set them up after having done all this work.
Right. How do you manage that with the individual that you're working with? And say a scenario where, they want to stay connected, but that may not be in their best interest given that both individuals are unhealthy at the time.
I think it becomes a major focus of treatment, and it's a conversation we want to have early on. It's always a gentle conversation because we also don't, this is presumably somebody that they love, somebody that they're committed to. And we also want to be cognizant of what's going to be the best thing for their spouse as well, because we want to create a situation where the person at home maybe gets some motivation to get well themselves. So we want to be working with them as much as is possible and having those conversations. But with the person that's in care, we do that. We start to involve peers in their treatment who have had similar situations, who have walked through it. We start to have conversations around, where are you going to be? Because we don't often take, a healthy person and a person who's still ill and put them together and get two healthy people. We tend to get two ill people. And so having those conversations and starting to gently but persistently talk about, listen, this is what's going to be safe. Ultimately, it's going to be their choice. They get to make that decision, but we want to help guide them towards, this is what experience shows us gives you the best chance.
Rob, in your experience, what are the typical best practices around case conferencing with families? What type of information, how often, and are there reasons in which you might do it in an urgent fashion versus a planned fashion? Help me understand that process.
Yeah, if the client that's is in treatment is sort of progressing within kind of normal parameters, then it would be sort of wise to have a sort of midpoint check-in or conference at that time. It's always important that the client themselves understand what we're sharing with the families, right? So we don't want to be sort of sharing information they're not comfortable with us sharing. When someone's in treatment, they disclose a lot. They're going to disclose things that they quite likely, kind of wouldn't disclose to parents. They wouldn't necessarily have disclosed this to their spouse. So we need to respect that confidentiality when we're having those conferences, and so to have a bit of a plan as we go into this is what the goal of the conference is. So midpoint is how are we doing? We're on track. Things are going well. And then at the end, it will be that discharge planning call where we're going to, again, sort of, kind of talk about what the plan is after treatment and how we're going to manage that. You might speed that up if somebody is, say, a week into treatment, somebody wants to leave and they want to leave treatment. You may kind of, but that perhaps grandpa, right, or grandma, or, aunt, or kind of anybody might talk them into staying. Somebody that they trust. They're building trust with us right at the treatment center, but it takes time. They're not going to walk in and immediately trust us. But if they could make a phone call, we might call whoever this trusted family member is, get them on the phone, organize a little conference to try to make sure that this person gets the help that they need and that they stay in treatment. I mean, one of the sort of mistakes that people, that centers make is that they don't update or prepare family members if we think there might be an early discharge initiated by staff. So perhaps somebody isn't doing well in treatment. They are inappropriately angry. They are, not participating in the program enough, and we're having the conversation with the client about this might not be the right place for you or the right time, which is fine. Maybe it's not the right time. One of the scenarios that you would move up a phone call or a conference with the family is if the client isn't progressing through treatment well. So perhaps they have, I mean, they've been in a fight, or they've been argumentative, or they have, aren't following the rules, they aren't participating. You may have to discharge somebody because this isn't the right time or place for them to access care, which is okay. It's not an outcome that we want, but sometimes that happens. One of the mistakes that centers make is that phone call becomes a surprise to the family. So we'll call and say, Jimmy hasn't been participating for the last 2 weeks, and they'll say, well, no one told me that, right? If we can call the family members and say, right, so as somebody might start to be not participating or they're not following the rules, we need to let families know that. So if there is an abrupt end to treatment, it shouldn't be abrupt to the family, right? They should be somewhat prepared that this might happen. And then when it does, and you'll go through, in treatment, you might have a treatment contract that you would sign with a client that would say, I'm going to participate fully, or I understand that might be my decision to leave treatment. The family member shouldn't be surprised by that early discharge. They need to be prepared for it.
The other piece that I think we need to think about, which really ties into that, is creating some communication channels between the client and the family that the center interacts with, so that we can start to both assess how their communication styles are, but more importantly, start to pick up on problems, particularly that the family's having adjusting to the change, and start to look at teaching them about different ways to say things, whether it's bringing them in and doing some communication training with them, because they're typically hanging on to anger, they're hanging on to resentments about what has happened. So as much as we can from the institutional level, we need to help the families heal as much as possible. And watching them communicate together is a really useful way to do that. And the other thing that I've used a lot is having conversations with them and saying, okay, what do you like about this person? And getting them to start to switch from negative thinking towards positive thinking. So, we like this and we like that about that person. But then add the question, what do we need from you? What do you need to see that things are different? And then reverse that and do it the other way, so that everybody's getting an open opportunity to let some of that stuff out, but also to look at the good.
What kinds of resources would you recommend for families to sort of prepare for those moments, right? When an individual comes into treatment versus, say, when they're at the midway point or about to discharge? Are there types of resources you'd recommend families to be engaging with?
Well, we all talked about Al-Anon and Nar-Anon. So if the families are engaging in a treatment process themselves, their language is will have changed. They're going to have a slightly different look at what's going on. Typically, they'll have stopped blaming that person, looking at the past. It's hard to get the family to the same place that the person coming out of treatment is at, because they've had 6 weeks or 2 months of very intense regular therapy, and the family hasn't typically had that much. So it's important to let the individual who's coming out of treatment know that you need to exercise some patience with your family. You need to let them know how you're doing. And using that, continuing to use that Recovery Capital Index at the end of treatment and after treatment with both family and patient is a really useful way to start to help people look at, okay, well, I'm not, this isn't getting better for me. This score is still pretty low. That's telling me that this is something that I need to work on. So, using those kinds of tools, I think, are pretty useful.
Bill, talk to me about the community transition process. We're nearing the end of treatment. We're thinking about the context of recovery for an individual, and of course the family system is one of those elements. How much is a family involved, and what does that look like?
I think it's a great question. I think that how involved is the family depends on a few different things. One being, what's their contact going to be like with the family following treatment? If somebody is moving back to Calgary and mom lives in Florida and they maybe talk twice a year, then their involvement's, maybe not going to be as intense. If they're moving back in with their spouse and their spouse, is a big supporter in the process, then their involvement might be quite a bit. And so what we'd want to do is, first of all, start having those conversations early, making sure that the family has all the support they need. Rand's talked about Al-Anon, Nar-Anon, ongoing therapy, aftercare, whatever it is for the family, making sure that they're not only connected with a therapist, but they're connected with other families. Because one of the big things we see is that everybody feels like they're the only ones going through this and they're the only ones struggling. And in fact, when they connect with other people, like sometimes that's when the magic happens, right? I think people grow when they feel cared about and supported. And when they start to connect with other people and feel cared about in those units, then that's really helpful. So even what we know is people are going to come home from treatment and everybody's going to be a little bit on edge and their antennae are going to be up and they're going to be really keeping a close eye on things. And if somebody, drops a potato peeler while they're making dinner, the family's going to go, oh my God, is he loaded again? Like this is, so we want to make sure that there's lots of support in place for the families so that they have an opportunity to decrease their level of anxiety. We also want to make sure that we've done some conferences before they head home so that everybody understands what is it going to look like. Everybody has an opportunity to know it's going to be a bit awkward in the beginning because, like Rand said, someone, gets all this therapy while they're in treatment and the family doesn't always have the opportunity to do nearly that much. So in a way, the person that's coming out of treatment is, to some extent, a new person, and the family's still dealing with that person that went in before in their heads, right? And so there's an innate miscommunication there. So we want to close that bridge as much as possible with some family conferences, some opportunities for them to talk about what are they excited about, but also what are they fearful about. And then we want to make sure that the person that's transitioning out of care into the community is really well connected with their aftercare provider so that they're getting lots of opportunity to not only talk about their own relapse prevention stuff, but talk about the complexities of dealing with their relationships in the world. That's maybe with their spouse, maybe with their parent, maybe with some of their old friends, and figuring out how to let go of some of those pieces if they're not healthy, or reconnect if they are healthy. We just want it to be as sort of comprehensive as possible so they get a maximum amount of support as they move over.
How do we really set both the individual and the family up for success at a practical level? I'm thinking things like, how do we help families establish which boundaries to set and how to set them, for example?
And anytime we do family therapy, discussing boundaries probably takes up 80% of our time, right? Because, as we've talked about earlier, if you're asking, how are you doing? Often the family will come back with, oh, well, here's how Jimmy's doing. Like, this is what's going on. And they have a hard time separating themselves from, the person, their loved one that needed care. And so when talking about boundaries, we think about boundaries as, like, how do I set limits with you, which is true. But it's also about, where do I end and you begin? How do I figure out who's me in all of this and who's you in all of this? And so we start, in terms of practical stuff, we start exploring some of that, hopefully long before somebody comes out of treatment. And we do that in those conferences, in those update conversations that Rob was talking about. We do it pretty consistently so that we start to identify where have they lost their sense of self and help them rebuild that. In terms of practical stuff, we want to talk about what are some of the concerns you have coming out of treatment? What are some of the fears you have? We want to put it all on the table, because what we know about our brains is that we fill in information when we don't have it, right? We fill in the gaps of information. And when we're doing that early out of recovery, we're not filling it in with wonderful, rosy things. We're often filling it in with, negative fears. So if somebody drops a potato peeler and mom suddenly looks anxious, they might come back with, mom thinks I'm a terrible person. Mom thinks I'm, definitely loaded. Mom's got all these fears, and really mom's just worried about her new potato peeler. So if we start to set, what are your fears? What are your concerns? But also, what are you hopeful about? What are you excited about? Who do you want to reconnect with? And have those conversations early, then it opens up a chance for them in that moment to talk about what's going on for you. The look on your face is strange. What's going on for you? And rather than fill in that gap with all the horrors that are in my head, I can then just have a conversation, right? And start to explore that. And have an opportunity to organically set boundaries in the moment instead of having to make it a big thing.
Right.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think one of the key components to a boundary post-treatment is that the family member understands they're not the monitor. Their role is not to, monitor whether or not the person's sort of clean or not, going to enough meetings, doing their counseling. That is one of the biggest traps I think family members and family systems fall into, is the person comes into treatment and then everybody's there to make sure that they're, sort of counting how many meals they're eating and how many hours of sleep they're getting, and just they're focused on everything right that the person's doing. That's a setup for failure, because the client's going to come out and feel like, I got no space, everybody's on top of me all the time. And family members often think that's their job, right? That they're going to, because again, they go back to, I want to fix it. So if we've done our work properly with the family during treatment, they should pull back from that. We can talk to the family about accountability is built into the discharge plan. They have a sponsor. Maybe if they're, have returned to work, or they're going to have, we actually have a monitoring system in place. They'll have a sponsor, they'll have a counselor. We can tell you that they're participating in that. We'll have an aftercare program associated with the treatment center that they go to. We can give you a report that says they're doing the things they need to do, and that's all you really need to know. Families that want to monitor and be on top of every move of the client, that doesn't work out for either party.
Like the way that I try and get people to understand boundaries is that they aren't set up to control another person. They're set up, you create a boundary to control how you're going to react to a situation, so that it's on you, not you got to sit this way or sit that way or do this or do that. It's, okay, if this happens, this is how I'm going to react to that situation. So it puts the responsibility on the family member, not on them to try and control that individual. Because like Rob said, if the person feels like they are getting over-controlled, they're going to react to that. And typically it isn't a useful reaction.
Right. Let's talk about the recovery process for families. How similar or dissimilar does it look like for the recovery of the individual in care?
Well, I think it's almost exactly the same. I know, like, I help people build recovery plans. Like, okay, these are the things that you need to do. What's a good time of day for you to do some exercise? What's a good time to do some meditation? When are you going to go to a meeting? When are you going to have a nap? And so I will help them write that out. And I do the same thing for families, so that they have a fairly concrete approach to what they're going to do different. Because if we don't do that, everybody's going to go back to doing the things that they used to do.
Right.
And some of those weren't particularly useful.
Right. We spend a lot of time building dysfunction around dysfunction, and that's an easy place to go back to.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the metaphors that I use is that it's like teaching a little kid to go across the street. We don't just say go across the street. We walk across the street with them a few times, and then we watch them walk across the street until we know that they're safe. So I think, continuing care is really important after treatment for both the family and for the individual, and helping them assess what's working and what isn't working. And so continued discussion about, how are you guys getting along? Is there anything bugging you? What do you need? Like I said before, those kinds of discussions on a continuing basis for a few months after treatment are really important, or people tend to slip back into old patterns.
Right, right. When we think about educating the family and the process around the recovery itself, addiction, the phenomenon that's been taking place in their home. What does that look like? Is there a rate of speed at which that should go? Is there a process or format at which that should go? How would you how would you advise organizations or professionals who are going to just start that initiating the educational process? Keeping in mind that a lot of time these individuals in the family system don't really see how impacted they've been. Rob, we'll go to you.
I think family members will often enter into a process, and that's the information that they're searching for, is they actually want to know about the neurobiology of addiction. They want to know, why did my loved one, sort of become an addict? And that is often where you would start, right? So that might be the beginning process of a family, sort of program, right? Or having conversations with families is, let's talk about what is addiction. Which is important, and I understand that their desire to know that, and I think it's important that we deliver that as part of the curriculum for sure. That's that can, I think, start right away. That's easy to digest. It's people can sort of understand that, and that's often what they're searching for. So they buy into the process. It gets them to buy in. That's the hardest part in working with families, is getting them to buy in. In my experience, the hardest part is that they need to do some of the work themselves, right? So at a center that we operated on the island, we opened up, we had a free dinner and an education series for family members, and right for all our alumni. There's about 100 invitations that went out. We offered free dinner, no cost. Just come out for a 6-part series. Nobody came. So getting them to buy in is oftentimes the most challenging part. And I think we do that by offering some education on addiction, on what it is. Then I think you move into, here's the impact it's had on the family, or family systems theory, and you start to work in a bit of, sort of how it's impacted everybody. And then thirdly, I think you really shift the focus to be, how has it impacted you as an individual, and then your treatment plan. And then, kind of moving towards discharge planning, for the family member.
What types of assessments might you use when trying to understand, say, the perceptions and attitudes of the family members have towards maybe addiction and recovery itself, Bill?
I think, first of all, the first thing to do is just build a little bit of a relationship to start off, and really get a sense of where they're at in the process. Because I think if you talk to the family, like as they're bringing somebody into treatment, and sit them down and go, okay, I'd like to do a few assessments with you, often they will desist pretty quickly from the program. Whereas if you start to build a bit of a relationship, you start to talk about, here's the basics of addiction, here's what it looks like. And then you also incorporate a little information on, hey, what we know is if you're working with families and the family is doing their work and they've engaged in some of their own treatment around it, the success rate of your loved one in care is much, much better. Often it helps families get a bit interested in it. And then we look at, assessing, the basic stuff that we would assess. And often it's very similar to what we're doing the assessments of the person that's coming to care. So we'd look at, what does your using look like? What does your history of using look like? What are any other sort of co-occurring psych conditions that we'd, worry about, anxiety or depression, anything like that. And then we'd want to really do a bit of an assessment around what are the family dynamics and what's the context that all this is occurring in, because it's not, I wish I could say, here's the 5 things that are indicative, but those 5 things are really important to know. What's the family context that these are coming up in? What's the cultural context that these things are coming up in? Certainly, different cultures mean that the way that a family unit presents itself, or even what we call a family unit, can be wildly different. So we want to have an understanding of what's the cultural background of the family we're working with. We also want to know a little bit about sort of what's their engagement with that culture, because it's easy to sort of jump to a conclusion. Culturally, this is typically what we see, but there's wild variability in that, right? So we want to always have it in context. We want to know a bit about what does their behaviors look like, what are they struggling with, and then we also want to talk about what's the impact that all of this has had on you. And then through that avenue, we get to say, okay, well, like, how have you compensated? What are your behaviors looking like? What are the things that you're struggling with now that maybe you're bringing to the table that you could work on?
Rand, question for you. Thinking about a scenario where you have kids in the picture, and when, let's say, a mother or a father is in a treatment setting and there's small children at home, to what extent should those children be communicated with, educated, supported? What would that process look like?
Well, what Rob said about the neurobiology piece, I think, is really important, and I've gone through that with fairly young kids, and one of the really interesting things about that is that, well, number one, like addiction is a brain problem. It's not a bad person problem.
Right.
And when you can show somebody how someone's brain has changed because of substance use, and also show them the potential for it to get better, then the whole energy shifts around that conversation, because what they see is, I thought they were just making bad choices. What I understand now is they lost the capacity to make a good choice,
Right.
because their brain changed. And so there's an instant shift in blame/forgiveness that happens. And little kids understand that really well too, because it's science-based. It's not all that complicated to explain. And, we all know that a picture's worth 1,000 words. And there's lots of really good material out there to help people understand, like anybody over like kind of 6 years old can start to put together the pieces. Mom was that way because that stuff changed her brain. That's not a bad mom.
Right.
And so that can start to create some really good discussions around what happens when people start to get better.
Right, right. A common question I've been asked over the years is from parents who have children while they're in treatment, and that question of, will my children inherit this? And I wondered maybe if you could talk about epigenetics and just what you would tell an individual in that scenario.
Well, when we look at that epigenetic piece, or there's even some like actual genetic susceptibility to addiction. I know, like when I shake my family tree, like there's drunks falling out of it all over the place. But helping them understand that their risk factor might be higher because of that is important. But the bigger piece with that is the stress that's passed on. So when kids are growing up in a family that's dysfunctional, they start to become anxious because things are not certain, things aren't predictable. And so letting everybody know that creating some stability and creating some predictability is going to help their kids. And then vice versa, because these things that used to happen won't be happening, you're going to feel safer, you're going to feel more cared for. Those kinds of discussions become really, really valuable.
I think too, it's like, even to roll it back a bit, a lot of people are really reluctant to involve their kids in their care at all. They're like, I've kept it very secret. My kids don't know. They're too young. They don't understand what's going on. And the things I always tell people, like, your kids know way more than you think they do, right? Your kids are way more aware of what's going on than you think they do. And if you're not addressing it and you're not helping them see where it's coming from and understanding the source and talking about, what's the implication of all this, then they're going to fill in those blanks, right? And little kids, what we know as humans is we don't do well. You don't take a 2-year-old and release them into the wild and on their own and have them like do very well, right? And so they're pre-programmed to think, like, I'm dependent on these parental figures in my life. And if mom is unpredictable and showing up in ways that, doesn't have stability and are giving me all this anxiety, then their choices are two. They can either consider that mom must be ill and there's nothing I can do about it and we're just rolling the dice every day on whether I'm going to survive this, or they're going to think I'm the problem. So to avoid that sort of the horror of it all, they have to default to thinking this must be my fault. And if I do something different, mom's going to get better. So that's when they start to develop shame, right? Because what we know is it's not their fault. There's nothing they can do that's going to influence that. And so they try these things over and over, and nothing changes, and their brain defaults to like, I must be inherently broken here. So if we're not working with those kids, they hold on to that. They hold on to that shame, and they build their thinking around it and their identity around it. And so it's critical to involve kids in care, even if they don't, like you say, starting at 6 even, like if we're not involving them, then they're going to fill in those blanks, and it's not going to be a positive thing. Right. Whereas if we can accept, they know a lot more than we think they know, and involve them, help them to understand, explain it to them, walk them through it so that they can understand, like, this is really nothing you can do, but here's the safety plan, and here's how we can keep you safe through this whole thing. They tend to do a lot better.
Yeah, and it's like that, the uncertainty that they were dealing with when mom or dad was in active addiction, we want to correct that by helping them understand as much as possible what's going on, so that they don't feel that constant, I don't know what's happening.
Right, right.
It's a challenge. I mean, I think it would be an area that needs vast improvement amongst addiction treatment, is reaching children. I think when we look at families, we often think of, spouse, parents, immediate family, adults, right? And it is an area I think that most centers could and likely should do better, right, in how to reach kids, because there isn't a specific there isn't a lot of programs that offer a specific kind of tailored to children kind of education series like Rand was talking about, right? Those would be different. They're going to deliver much of the same information. You also need staff that are trained, I think, in how to work with kids and how to do that, and that can be often different than the staff you would hire at a treatment center, right? You don't necessarily sort of kind of do that, or necessarily think it's almost like a separate kind of program that you would need to develop. I think it's an area for vast improvement that that we don't do particularly well in the industry right now. And I do think it takes a bit of being mindful of specific programming designed for kids. You get yourself into disclosures from children and having to respond to those. You can get yourself into some areas that you're going to need to, respond to. Have a team of, kind of professionals that understand, kind of social workers, et cetera, that are going to have to wind their way through some of these issues once you do bring in sort of small children and minors into the equation. So I think it's an area that is needed for families to get well in it, right, sort of their, kind of entirety. Not one that we do particularly well right now in the industry, and one that has some challenges to it.
Help me understand, definitionally speaking, what is a family? Like when someone comes into a treatment setting, what is the family system? Is it the traditional sort of nuclear family, thinking about, cultural appreciation here? What is a family?
It can be wildly diverse, right? It's easy for us to think of it as kind of the traditional nuclear family, like parents and kids. Certainly sometimes it is that. But this is where considering the cultural component comes in. Depending on what the cultural context is, that family unit might involve extended family, might involve grandparents, might involve aunts and uncles, might involve very close community members. And then we get into this idea of, sort of families of creation, families of choice. So if there's people that we have come into treatment who have very close friendships, very, that are impacting their life day to day, they might be a person that they consider part of their family. So that's something that we want to also be sensitive to. It's not so easy to define. It's not just the genetic piece. It's not just we're related by blood, therefore we must be families. There's, there's step parents, there's friends, there's even, work families if you're very close that way. So there's a lot to consider, and a lot of it comes down to what does the client consider their family, and how do we run with that and support them through it. We think about who's going to impact them following treatment.
And I think going through an assessment with the person in treatment about, okay, who's in your life? Who's in your world? Are they on side with what you're doing? Are they somebody that's going to support you when you come out? Or are they going to push you in the wrong direction, so that they can start to make some assessment about who they want to pull into a support circle and who maybe they want to distance themselves from a little bit. I think those are important conversations. And you know, if they come from a smaller community, it could be as big as that whole community. So it really varies.
I think the social and the familiar, assessments and recovery capital in that assessment early on with a client will tell you who they view as their family, right? That's been a sort of tool that, who's their support? Who is that person? And right in the context of addiction treatment and trying to, build an aftercare plan, who are the people that are going to be in your corner? And that could be, as was said, sort of vastly different for every individual.
Bill, Rob, and Rand bring tremendous experience to this conversation about the role of families in the recovery journey. For me, this conversation underscores the complexities of when and how to involve family members. Family dynamics are often a double-edged sword, loving and caring, but also dysfunctional, and at times laden with trauma. Tread carefully.